and that begins in 4 parts. And so that's moving up from the south, particularly with Arab groups, from the north, primarily with the YPG, also with the YPG in and around Ain Issa. And I think the most difficult one that still needs to be taken is both in the Euphrates River Valley, near the town of Bukamal, and then in what we call here in Washington the Manbij Pocket. It's moving west of the Euphrates, so that ISIS is really squeezed, so that maybe in a couple of months you can begin to see the actual taking of the capital city of Raqqa, and that these operations now are just sort of the opening gamut to try and put pressure on the city. Yeah, I think that's one of the main issues that the United States and the Kurdish forces on the ground will have to deal with as they move forward. It's that you can take a lot of territory from ISIS with the Kurdish fighters and with American air power, but once you move past that and you're able to move ISIS out of these cities, it's how do you actually govern these areas. And I think that there are general concerns, I think here and probably even amongst Kurdish areas inside Syria and Iraq, is about how it works when you have Kurds in control of majority Arab cities. And so I think this is where the sort of multi-ethnic component of the SDF becomes even more important. It's that as you begin this process to move sort of in the northern areas around Raqqa, it's what Arabs can you bring into the SDF, how can those Arabs then be counted upon to govern, and then what role would then the YPG have, perhaps as, you know, even a neighboring power, if you will, as a way to share power inside these different areas inside Syria. I don't think there's a plan for a much larger U.S. presence. This campaign from the outset is trying to use sort of elements of U.S. warfare that have been, I'd say, largely successful in previous conflicts in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and even in northern Iraq with the Peshmerga during the 2003 invasion, which is a small number of special operations forces that are able to really work with local militias or local groups on the ground to call in airstrikes and to really allow airstrikes to help, you know, aid the offensive of the local groups. And I think it's been particularly effective inside of Syria because of the cohesion of the YPG and the SDF, the single command structure, and the overlapping goals between the United States and the Syrian Kurds about the need to take on ISIS first and foremost. Well, I think that's one of the things that needs to be taken up. It's that as the YPG, you know, becomes even more and more important to the U.S. war plan, there's a disconnect in both the war plan in the eastern part of the country for ISIS and, let's say, the war in the west, which is largely political and that the Secretary Kerry is running. And here is that you're running into problems primarily on the Turkish side about how to include the YPG. I mean, and what role they should play in Geneva. Me personally, as an analyst, thinks that they should be involved in the Geneva process as a third party, because the YPG is a unique force inside the Syrian conflict in that they are basically dedicated to fighting ISIS. They are, you know, not part of the formal, let's call them Syrian opposition, the Free Syrian Army, and that multitude of factions that fight with that. And so, you know, you have to figure out a way to bring them into the process, and that remains to be a work in progress. I don't think so. I mean, I think the military planning is going on independent of our election cycle. If anything, you know, the Democrats, you know, that Barack Obama supports, and that probably Hillary Clinton will be the next supporter, would like to see Raqqa taken before November when our election is held. But the military planning is really being first and foremost. Is taking the lead on this, and I think the things that they are working through is the composition of the after ISIS force. You know, there's little doubt inside the United States that ISIS will be defeated, particularly in Raqqa, but it's what comes after ISIS and how do you govern territory where ISIS has been ousted from. Well, this becomes one of the problematic things. You know, it's again this composition of the force that would move west across the Euphrates and into what we call here in Washington the Manbij Pocket. And this is where you run into a very hard political problem or policy problem for the United States government. It's that on one hand you have a very effective Syrian Kurdish force that is you know, taking the lead in the fight against ISIS with our partnership. But on the other hand, you have a Turkey who has been a NATO ally since 1952, and when you look longer term, you know, you'll have a U.S. government that wants to maintain ties with Ankara as well. And so I think there is some appetite for a YPG-led offensive for Manbij and perhaps Jarablus, but there is a dedicated effort here in the United States to try and bring together other forces further west to try and save the relationship with Turkey. Now I think it's very tactical in that our interests overlap completely, in that we both want to defeat ISIS. And the policy planning that's going on here in the United States is then how do you deal with basically a post-Assad, post-Islamic State Syria that addresses every person's interests, and one of those is definitely the Syrian Kurds. And I think a good parallel to this is that when the United States got involved militarily in Iraq in 1991 with Operation Provide Comfort and the no-fly zone over what is now Iraqi Kurdistan, we had these same problems too. These same policy problems, and you see how policy moves forward, and ultimately we are where we are with the KRG. I wouldn't put it past something similar to happen here in to happen similar in that short-term military planning leads to entrenched policy planning, and so that then you have to come up with a more coherent policy on, say, a decentralized Syrian state, one of which those decentralized would be for Syrian Kurds.